All right, good evening, all. Welcome to another edition, number 8 of Starfleet Tactical. I'm Alec Peters, your host, and here with Chris Weave and Pat Doyle. How are you guys doing? Welcome back.
Doing very well, thanks.
I think
Pat, you're very quiet.
I'm very quiet.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
Pat's very quiet. I can barely hear Pat. Check your audio settings there, sir. Hope everyone's doing well. We're gonna we've got a few things to talk about this week, and I am going to let me check on our. And I will check. We had a bunch of new people last night, which was really encouraging. And let's check on the comments. Who we got here? Got a bunch of the regulars. Dave M, Wright Sublette, Olive Drab, Jim Westbrook, Old Code, Karen B, Matthew Bracey, Scott Voigt. Hello, hello, hello. Let's just scroll down. Patricia Pitts. There you go. That looks like it's a Lokay. How are you? Hello from Sydney, he says. So hello to you too, sir. Hope everyone's doing great. I did today was a bunch of cleanup for me, and I actually worked for a few hours on shipping. So it was like shipments that were getting returned and cleaning out the inbox, and so today was a lot of cleanup. Hello, Mach 2214. Howdy from Welling Township of Cherokee County, Oklahoma. Hello. Well, howdy to you too, sir. Crystal's heading out to Oklahoma on Wednesday to deliver the puppy that we have to Michael Weir, one of our vice admirals on Patreon. Remember, and just so everyone remembers, we are supported by a Patreon campaign. And what happened, and this is how we keep the studio open, and the studio supports all these live streams. So the Patreon campaign does a lot of good. Also helps Gwinnett County high school students use our studio. I don't know if that's going to happen this year, though. Geez, with everything that's going on. But nonetheless, they've made 6 fan films, 6 student films at the studio this past year. So please do check out our Patreon campaign, and also make sure you go down there on the scroll to the Aries Studio store and check out all the cool swag that we have there. I just was working on the new pins, and we got new challenge coins come in, and the blueprints. So I put the blueprints in the Aries Studio store. The USS Geronimo model was selling gangbusters. I think we've sold I don't know, at least 15 or 16 of them in the past few days.
Cool.
That's a popular one. And we're about to release the Korolev. Burke Burnett, hello he says aloha from Hawaii. Aloha. How are you doing, Burke Burnett? Christian Barger, how are you, sir? Good to see you. Delon Weave. Any relation?
My brother. one of my 2 brothers. So he's a regular. He's been, I think. Yeah,
we've emailed a couple times.
Yeah, he's watched, if not he's certainly seen them all on YouTube if he hasn't watched them all live.
There you go. Rose Kirby, good morning to you. Rose is in the UK. So I get you guys were over in Two Geek Girls. I hope that was a good show. We raced home from the Cuban restaurant. It took them forever to serve us our coffee and dessert. I think we waited absolutely 20 minutes, and because it was 20 of 9, and I was like, well, do you want to take this to go? And she's like, no, we'll get it in time. And it took them till 9 o'clock. They served us. So we wolfing down some tres leche cake and our cafe con leche, and raced home. And I had to drop Crystal off because I had to go out and get the little onesies for the dog. So the dog got neutered, and so they put the cone of shame on. And I always feel awful. It was like, oh, that must be so uncomfortable. So we go out, and what we do is we get little baby onesies, and we put that on them, and then they still can't, so they can't get to their stitches and lick their stitches or pull on their stitches or anything. But As Crystal aptly pointed out, I forgot to put the diaper on first and then the onesie. You mean the dog doesn't know how to use a toilet? Jesus. Anyway, so how you guys have a good week?
Good but busy week.
Busy's good.
Yeah, yes. Busy in general is good, but it was like it was busy in ways that didn't allow me to get to a bunch of things I was going to do. So it was not a whole lot of things got crossed off the to-do list. I was too busy doing the things that got added onto the to-do list.
I had the same exact week. Starting on Monday, I've got these 3 things I have to do. And I sat down Monday and it was like, nope, can't do it. Can't, and I got pushed off. Tuesday, nope, that came up, and then my lawsuit I was suing a prop deal in Las Vegas. And then that was like Wednesday all day. I'm going back and forth with the lawyer. And so that wasted Wednesday. And, I'm trying to get out the orders and oh my God, that was the week. So I still, for tomorrow, have the 3 things I had last Monday on my list to do. Which of course are the 3 things I really don't want to have to do. It's like, oh man, I've got to, I'm basically writing legal letters to lawyers, either threatening them or saying, here's my terms, take it, nonsense. So I'm trying to avoid it. And I guess life is stepping in and saying, we'll take this. How about you, Pat? How was your week? I got nothing done we were supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, kind of similar. I had a funeral to go to in Cincinnati at the beginning of the week, and then, so that was the sad part of the week. Nice part of the week, we picked up 2 new kittens. So, I have cats for the first time in my life now.
Wow! Now, are these rescue kittens?
What's that?
Are these rescue kittens?
Yeah. Yep.
Good man.
From a litter, and named Simon and River.
Very cool. Very cool. Good for you.
So we've been, all the little kids in the neighborhood been coming over to our house, pretty much every day. So
good.
Play around with the cats and everything. So it's been fun.
Listen, the great things about cats are they're so much easier to train than dogs.
Yeah, we set that little thing down in in the litter box, and then from that moment on, that's where they went.
You don't really have to train cats to use a litter box. You just have to show them where it is.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's exactly right. So, it's just a little easier because at some point we're going to get back to traveling and doing stuff, and having to pawn off your dog every week or every couple weeks when it gets old. So with cats, we can at least leave for the day or leave for a couple days and not feel too guilty about it. But I suspect neighborhood kids would be more than happy to come by and feed them and check on them. So easy enough.
Having dogs is like having toddlers. Having cats is like having high school students.
Yeah, that's probably about right.
I mean, I have no problem leaving my cat for a couple of days and just going off and then coming back.
Yeah.
Oh God, jeez, that's that's awesome. That is awesome.
Yep.
But I do remember the one time we went away on a vacation, and it was with Diana, my last girlfriend, and she had a cat, and I think we went away for a weekend. And anyway, we got back on Sunday night, and it had a bad case of diarrhea.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, the apartment was a mess. And it was, cleaning its butt on everything. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That was ugly. But other than that.
Well, that kind of crap, that kind of stuff is inevitable with a pet at some point or another.
or a child.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the difference is that the cats and the dogs don't cost you $250,000 over their lifetime.
That's true. That's true.
If you send them to public school. So what are we going to talk about tonight, gentlemen? Chris, what do you have on the agenda for tonight?
Well, there's a bunch of things we could talk about, but there was something that I sort of thought of as a follow-up to last week, which I don't know if Pat saw I think Pat saw the Facebook message I sent earlier. It occurred to me that last week I talked about carrier battle groups and stuff like that, but I didn't talk about ship types at all. And I think it's a little bit interesting to have a little conversation about that. Yeah, thank you, buddy, for pawing me on the face. Thank you. Because Star Trek, of course, first came out in the 1960s, and the U.S. Navy redid its ship classification scheme in 1975. So what was sort of how they thought about ships before that changed in 1975, and after that, a bunch of things weren't done the way that they were done before. And you see echoes of that, for instance, in the old FOSSA Star Trek game.
You're right, because frigates were more powerful in the old FOSSA game.
Yes, and frigates is exactly where I'm going on this, because frigate is this really interesting ship type in that, you go back to the Age of Sail, and a frigate is a warship designed for independent operation, usually like either functioning as a scout or functioning, would relay signals, or functioning as a merchant raider, right? So frigates were the ships that you went out to attack enemy shipping. But when you had a big battle, a line of battle, when the big ships got together, you didn't use frigates for that, because they'd really be a weak point in the line. They just had smaller guns and not as strong hulls and stuff. So frigates had this very specialized role, and everybody wanted a frigate command, because if you went and captured enemy ships, enemy merchanters, you got a cut of it, right? So a lot of captains didn't want to have a big 80-gun ship of the line. They wanted a frigate because you could make more money with a frigate.
Well, you don't have those niggling admirals bothering you all the time. You go be an independent command, and you're away from the bureaucracy.
Yeah, and you don't have to follow the other guy in line and all that other stuff. You can just sort of go off and do your thing. And so in the post-World War II era, the United States Navy used the term frigate to describe what they before that had called a destroyer leader. So it was like a bigger ship designed to be the lead ship with a squadron of destroyers. And so for a long time we had destroyers, and then we had frigates, and then cruisers, and then aircraft carriers or battleships in the days when we had battleships. And the rest of the world really kind of didn't do it that way. In the rest of the world, a frigate was smaller than a destroyer. And so in 1975, they just said, we're going to change it all. And one of the reasons why they did it is that there was this, what was referred to as the cruiser gap, because we didn't have enough cruisers. We weren't building cruisers. And so they decided what they would do is they'd take all those frigates and they'd start calling them cruisers. And then they'd invent a new type of ship that would be smaller than a destroyer. That was generally what we were calling a corvette beforehand, when we had anything like that. And that would be the new frigate. And so they just, with the stroke of a pen, they changed all this stuff. The Ticonderoga class destroyer leader became Ticonderoga class, or destroyer. It was going to be a Ticonderoga class frigate, which was abbreviated, if I remember correctly, DDL. They just, stroke of a pen, they turned it into a cruiser.
I never knew the Ticonderoga was ever called a cruiser, or called a frigate, or a destroyer.
I think it was, I think if I remember correctly, DDL was the frigate classification, which is kind of weird if you think about it. It's been a while since I've sort of looked that up, but it's kind of, and it, there was our use and there was other people's uses, et cetera, et cetera. And it's always fun going back and looking at Star Trek. Pat's got a much better handle on like what they did in Starfleet battles, et cetera. But in a lot of science fiction, you see this tendency to have every possible ship type sort of coexisting at the same time, despite the fact that in the real world, those ship types never existed at the same time. There's really, while there's utility in differentiating different ships, like you'd have 70-gun ships of the line, or you'd have like first raters or second raters or whatever, and that would sort of change over time as the standards change. You didn't really have like 15 different ship types under the age of sail, just like you don't really have 15 different ship types now. But in science fiction, a lot of times you see just like, light cruisers, heavy cruisers, battle cruisers, attack cruisers, defense cruisers, strike cruisers, just throw them all out. And then you do the same thing with various flavors of battleship, etc. And yeah, all those different designations were used at one point or another, but they weren't all used at the same time. So, Pat, how does Starfleet Battles do all that?
Oh, they go with basically frigates are the small ships, destroyers are a little bit bigger. Then they had light, medium, and heavy cruisers. Then they had dreadnoughts,
Okay.
and then they had battleships. And then if you assume that as far as sort of in the most basic terms, as far as like what had the most combat with combat power, if you had if a cruiser was, let's say, 1 on the combat power scale, a dreadnought was about 1.5, and a battleship was the equivalent of roughly 2 heavy cruisers. And then, you had frigates, which were about half or a third of a heavy cruiser as far as that went. Just depended on kind of how they set up its movement cost. But yeah, it went frigate, destroyer, light cruiser, medium cruiser, heavy cruiser, dreadnought, battleship. So
I didn't realize that they had both dreadnoughts and battleships.
Yeah. Battleships were huge, and then think of it actually like turn of the century and turn of the 20th century. They came out with HMS Dreadnought. That was the first one, and then if you think of battleships like World War II style battleships, they were clearly much more powerful. Yeah,
it's sort of funny because in the real world, they invented the idea of dreadnought. I don't know that they ever actually, if anybody ever actually had a ship class called dreadnought. Dreadnought was more of a slang term that they used to differentiate between old battleships and new battleships.
Yeah.
Old style and new style, because HMS Dreadnought was such a design revolution. And USS Michigan, because we actually put down, a lot of people were talking about all big gun battleships. It's not like the Brits like secretly did this and everybody else went, oh wow, we never thought about that. There were a whole bunch of people that were talking about that.
Yeah. There was one other thing. You had you had heavy cruisers. Then there was the battle cruiser, which was kind of in between the heavy cruiser and the dreadnought.
And what's the only differentiation there? Sort of like how powerful?
It was simply a more powerful heavy cruiser. It still didn't necessarily have the firepower of a dreadnought, but so it doesn't necessarily work in the same way that you think of a battle cruiser in World War II, World War I style ships, where it's the firepower of a battleship, but the speed of a heavy cruiser just lacks the armor. The battle cruisers in Starfleet battles, they were basically just bigger, bulkier, heavy cruisers. So they were good. But yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, Starfleet Battles was a game based on the old series, and they only got the licensing for the original series, and it was designed in the late 70s, and it still goes to this day. And frankly, it's probably one of the most interesting starship combat games around. And then they modernized it a little bit with a game called Federation Commander. Some people would take issue with that, but it's a more streamlined version of the game, and both are really fun, very tactically interesting games. And then in the late 80s, around the time of Star Trek III, they came out. FASA, a separate company called FASA, they had the license for the actual Star Trek stuff, and that's where we get the 4 Years' War. They had some of that stuff. FASA did that. But they had their own separate Starship combat game, and I used to play that when I was in 7th and 8th grade a lot, and it was tons of fun back in the day. So, but ultimately not as tactically interesting as Starfleet Battles and Federation Commander, of which I'm a huge fan. So,
yeah, Starfleet Battles. I mean, a little nuance to what Pat just said. Starfleet Battles. Never actually had the license for the TV show. They got their license through Franz Joseph Designs, which did the Star Trek technical manual. And so, like, you won't ever see Enterprise, I don't think, in Starfleet Battles. Is that correct, Pat?
Enterprise shows up on the list of ships because it's in the Franz Joseph book, but they can't mention any of the characters or anything like that.
Yeah.
So ultimately, it's a sort of, think of it as a separate Star Trek timeline. You know, after the original series, it diverges because we never get to truly see the movie stuff.
Yeah, it's a different timeline because J.J. Abrams wasn't involved with it. It doesn't suck.
I'm sorry?
It's a different timeline, but because J.J. Abrams wasn't involved with it, it doesn't suck.
Yeah, well, if you study their time, speed, distance, and their maps, it's all internally very consistent and stuff. So, you know, their warp, they use a consistent warp speed scale. They think about the operational level of war and all this kind of stuff. It all kind of holds together pretty well. They actually thought through all of that because ultimately they made a giant empire-spanning game called Federation and Empire, where you can play out, you know, the battles between the Feds, the Klingons, the Romulans, the Tholians, the Orions, the Gorns, and then several other empires that they created. The Zinti, which we saw in the cartoons. So they did all of that kind of stuff. So anyways.
Yeah, that comment that just popped up from Christopher Bailey. Yeah, that's sort of the traditional view of that. In fact, that HMS Dreadnought made all other ships in the world obsolete, all other non-big gun battleships obsolete, including the ones in the British fleet. In fact, that's the reason why there were some naval officers who thought that building the new type of ship was actually a really big mistake, because it created this situation where they had the biggest fleet in the world, and now you could argue that fleet was obsolete and had to be replaced because everybody else was going to be gunning for it. You know, my point on my response to that is, if there was anybody who could afford to replace their fleet at that time, it was the British Empire. They had all the shipbuilding capability, so they're still in a comparative advantage. And the other thing is that it's not like the technology goes away, you know, if you don't do it. I mean, we had already put down USS Michigan. The reason why they're called dreadnoughts as opposed to Michigans is because they built faster than we did. I mean, we started first, they finished first, and so they became known as dreadnoughts. There's some interesting articles that I mentioned once before, I believe, from a guy named Karl Lautenschlager, who was an analyst at Los Alamos National Laboratories, if I remember correctly, where he talks about how all the different pieces that went into the dreadnought revolution, and he points out that all of those technologies had been deployed on Navy ships for like a decade, some of them for as long as, you know, more than a decade. And it was a combination of things that when you put them together, you got this tremendous leap in capability compared to an old style battleship. And so it really was a revolution. And they did end up sort of making all these ships obsolete, which then Fisher had to get rid of because he had to, you know, if you've got an old ship, in some instances, having an old ship is worse than not having a ship at all, because it doesn't really bring anything to the table, but you still gotta paint it and maintain it and find a pier space for it. You know, you got to find a parking spot for it, and you still have to crew it and all that other stuff. So Fisher ended up just scrapping a whole bunch of stuff so that he could afford to build the fleet that he wanted.
You know, it is somewhat related, and this, Pat, I'm sure Pat is totally familiar with what I'm about to say, but we always used to talk in the technology industry, we always used to talk about first mover advantage. mean, if you were the first mover in technology, you had a huge advantage. And whenever we study this in terms of technology companies, we would always talk about the greatest exception to that rule, which was the de Havilland Comet, which was the first commercial jetliner. And this kind of ties into what you were talking about with building Dreadnought. The Brits got the de Havilland Comet into the air first before the Boeing 707 or any of those ships. But
and then the countryside was littered with the
three of them
falling out of the sky.
3 comets go down in a year, which for any airframe is just catastrophic. And they realized there were serious structural defects in it. The most notable of which is they literally had square windows, and so the corners would break apart, and which is why they had to redesign. And then all airplanes have oval windows now. But that was the one time first mover advantage was real disadvantage. But that is not that's the exception to the rule, and nonetheless, that is not why you don't build dreadnoughts.
And I love the one comment that one of the U.S. airplane manufacturers, when they finally figured out that those square windows is where the big problem was, is that it was a stress point, and then a crack would form, and then next thing you know, your airplane's splitting apart into 2 pieces, which I'm pretty sure is bad. But one of the U.S. airplane
pilot, it's hard to fly 2 separate planes.
One of the U.S. airplane manufacturers said, none of us would have caught that. It could have been any of us.
Yeah, which is why, everyone learned from that and redesigned their planes.
Yeah, and it's not like airplanes hadn't had square windows before.
But jets did, right? But
right. You didn't have nearly the stresses. They didn't fly as high. They didn't fly as fast. They, et cetera, et cetera. But
yeah, yes, indeed. Listen. So anyway, all right. Well, so why don't you lead? Are we going to focus on ship types? Is that what you want to discuss?
Well, I don't know. Is there more to talk about that?
I don't know. Covered it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well covered. I mean, that seems pretty well covered without going into nitnoid detail on each thing. The only thing I'd say about Star Trek as far as ship types, they have a ship specifically called an Explorer, right?
Class.
Or a class, yeah, ship class. And that's probably I would guess that the requirements for that is a ship that can operate independently for years without support if it needs to, so it can go out and do stuff, which is not a class that's in traditional navies.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point. This is one of those things that until I started actually doing stuff with the Navy, I didn't understand exactly how weird Star Trek is in that regard. U.S. Navy Carrier Strike Group does an underway replenishment probably twice a week. Like every 3 to 5 days on average. And in part, that's just because the air wing uses up so much fuel. And in part, you always want to have the tanks topped off in case, the balloon goes up and you have to immediately go do something like, oh, we need you to be 3,000 miles in that direction tomorrow. You should leave now, sort of deal. They can't do it if you just do the time distance, you can't do it in 24 hours. But you sort of add all that up, and there's very definitely a tether, right? You've got this long supply chain that goes back to bases ashore that keeps the ships well supplied, and they need supplies fairly often. And we started developing that capability in the interwar period, the ability to refuel ships at sea, and it was really sort of like in the early part of World War II that we really sort of got that down to a science. And that's one of the things that I would always use. If you can't do underway replenishment, you're not a real Navy, right? Real navies can do underway replenishment. Real navies can stay at sea. They don't have to go back to their base in order to put more fuel on board. in Star Trek, this entire idea that we're going to go out on this, we're going to go out and we're going to be alone and unafraid for weeks or months at a time. The last time terrestrial navies did that was back in the days of wooden ships with sails.
Mm-hmm.
Once steam came into it, and once you had to coal them, and all the rest of it, and you had to actually supply parts as opposed to just having your carpenter make one of whatever it was. Once all that stuff happened, you really became tethered to shore, and all your naval strategy became based upon that. So, go ahead, Pat.
Oh no, I was just going to say. So yeah, as far as ship types, that's definitely one of the types that is different. So there's some of the ships of the Starfleet book.
Yeah.
Probably have a copy of that. One of the things they talk about are perimeter action ships, which, as far as I can gather, that ship's purpose is, patrol the borders,
Right.
and sound the alarm if some bad guy starts invading. And looking at the, and they did some pretty good work on it, but looking at its weaponry and that kind of stuff, it's got a lot of aft firing weaponry, and it's really fast. So it's made to be running away and shooting as it's being chased. So
I think the perimeter action ships are in the second book.
I think you're right, and I don't think I have.
It's the red one.
Is it the red one?
Or is it the silver one?
I think it's the silver one, which I don't. These are actually my duplicate reading copies because I've got everything packed away and in storage, and so I actually went to the trouble of buying extra copies of some of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have the perimeter action ships as a.
Yeah. I've got a different version of it, but definitely the same thing.
Yeah.
So anyways, those are, that's an interesting fan created, or I tend to kind of consider that pretty good canon. That's pretty good technical information, holds together pretty nicely. Those books are fantastic for anyone's interested in the different starships and classes and stuff like that. So
yeah, they really are quite well done.
Yeah.
And they're they're like 30 years old now.
Oh yeah.
They are at that.
I remember when they were brand spanking new, and you know why I remember that? Because
Because you were young then. But so yeah. So as far as the ship classes go, that's pretty much it. But I mean, and in Star Trek, I think as they go through the next generation, right? I mean, we see up until the Borg wiped them out at 359, Wolf 359, that they were just hanging on to a lot of old ships, and those ships are definitely meant to last a long time. And you can probably keep. I don't know what the limitation is on how much you can continually refit and modernize a particular hull, but apparently they do it for quite a bit until the Borg, prove to them that, hey, maybe old 100-year-old ship designs isn't the way to go if you want to survive in this galaxy.
So Pat and I have had multiple conversations this week with our fellow Bu9 member Andy Presby about various things associated with ship creation in this universe, and how replicators work. I mean, a lot of it came down to how industrial-sized replicators work and stuff like that. And it's actually way more complicated than just it's a specialized transporter. There's a lot of stuff in there, and we've got a lot of very tantalizing pieces about how it works, but most of those pieces are in very particular contexts that it's interesting how you would extrapolate it, right? Like in the Deep Space Nine technical manual, there's a discussion about how the Federation had given to the Bajorans a couple of industrial replicators, and it makes this comment about how that traditional manufacturing techniques are used for a lot of different things because it's more economically efficient to do that than it is to use the industrial replicators. And so, okay, is that that statement generally applies, and that statement would apply in the Federation also? Or is that a statement that is based upon the idea that the Bajorans only have 2 of them? Right? Because, depending upon if these things are available in every street corner, you're going to end up with a much different answer than if the answer is there's exactly 2 on the planet, get in line. We don't know. There's a thing where it talks about food replicators, about how they start off with a particular feed mass because when you're transporting something, the implication is that when you're transporting something, if you're going from the same quantum state to the same quantum state, it's way more energy efficient than if you have to manipulate it during the process. And it says something about how the feedstock all is basically of a baseline neutrals to minimize the energy used. It's like, okay, but is that important for an industrial replicator? Does that mean that if I want to build something, if I want to replicate something that is, 55% tritanium and 40% carbon fiber and 5% silicon, that I just have to have like piles of that shit there and I can manipulate it that way? I don't think they really answer that. Maybe it's there and I just haven't found it yet. Well, yeah, I'm sure they don't want to. I'm sure well, they've gone a long way down that path to show you a little bit behind the curtain, but I'm reminded of the answer that Mike Okuda always gets when he's asked in the transporter, there's a device called a Heisenberg compensator. And when he's asked, how does the Heisenberg compensator work? He says, very well, thank you. So I've often thought that transporters are the single technology in Star Trek that doesn't have nearly the effect I would expect it to. I'm beginning to rethink that a little bit because it sounds like there's a lot more restrictions there. They just make it look easy, but it's not really as easy as it seems. Still sort of working that through in my own mind. But, there's a line in the Next Gen Tech Manual that says they can't replicate entire starships. And realistically, if you did have that power, you probably wouldn't need starships. But, so the big question is, how much of a starship do you replicate? And so, like, I'm bringing all these old hulls back into service because I need to go fight the Borg. How much of that, how easy is that? Claude Barabee wrote that article that we talked about last week, which I put a link for in last week's show. I did that earlier today, about arguing that in Star Trek Picard, they had basically one ship type that showed up in that episode with Riker commanding the task force. That there's Claude argues that having only one ship type is more efficient, that you get economies of scale. I'm not sure that it quite works that way in the Star Trek universe.
True, but you still have to train the people in the crews.
Yeah.
And I understand you can standardize how various systems work and stuff like that, but
yeah, as my friend Brian McHugh says, the science that makes Star Trek science fiction is management science. Everything seems to be incredibly well run, and the crews are incredibly well trained. The absolute worst performer on any episode of Star Trek I've ever seen is the sort of guy that a modern naval officer would kill to have in his department. And they're just all really fantastic, and I sometimes wonder if when you're doing the equation that sort of that you solve to figure out what the most efficient way to do something is, like, the sort of thing that an economist would have. I sometimes think that some of the values in that equation in the Star Trek universe are so different than the sort of values that you would have in modern America that you end up with a sort of a dramatically different answer. But don't quite know yet. Still working on that one.
Let's just take it aside. What, for each of you, what is your favorite ship in Star Trek, not the Enterprise? What's your favorite ship and why?
Are we limited to canon sources?
No, let's go with anything. Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say there's some really, really nifty looking fan designs that I really like. And most of them are ones that I know it when I see it, but I can't necessarily say, oh yeah, it's the such and such. Oh yeah, it's this. Oh yeah, it's that. Of canon sources, I actually really like the NX-01 design. I think that's a fine looking ship, and I think that inside and out, I think they did an excellent job of making it look both high tech and primitive at the same time. And I think from an exterior standpoint, it's, it did what it needed to do, and I kind of like how they put all that together. I think they did an excellent job with that.
I like the design that the NX-01 was based off of. I'm the Akira's always struck me because it's an interesting, different, non-traditional design. And then there's also, it's also somewhat controversial, I guess. There are some people who say, well, it's got 15 photon torpedo tubes and I've seen, different people having models and stuff like that, where you've got port and starboard torpedo tubes, and then on the roll bar on top, it's got torpedo tubes. And then in First Contact, you also see it firing torpedoes out of the bottom of the saucer and right above it. So it really does appear to have quite a few torpedo tubes. It's a torpedo ship as opposed to a phaser ship. It's got its big phaser, Type 10 phaser around the saucer and stuff. But it's a fast, sleek design, and then supposedly it carries some fighters. That saucer. Now, I've never sat down and done the math on how big is a Peregrine fighter. The fighters that they're using in the Dominion War, and how big is the saucer, and how many could you fit in that supposed area that they call the carrier bay. I've never done that layout. Perhaps Trekyards or Fleet Yards has done that at some point. I don't know. But anyways, interesting design. It looks fast, sleek, modern. It's a little bit of a departure. But you mentioned Enterprise, so probably my movie era Enterprise, the motion picture Wrath of Khan Enterprise. That design is still pretty much one of my favorites, also.
Yeah, it's sort of. I think it's kind of interesting. You can, among Star Trek fans, you can almost, I think, put them in age brackets by which Enterprise they prefer. Because I know both Pat and Andy prefer the movie Enterprise, whereas I if I have to choose between the two different ones, I prefer the original series TV show Enterprise over the movie Enterprise.
Yeah.
There's things about the movie Enterprise that I just don't like. There's some things I like a lot, but there's other things I just don't like. Most specifically, I think I don't like sort of the intersection between the struts for the engines and the secondary hull. It just really looks like they put them in the wrong place. If you look at the front view of the original series Enterprise, basically those struts they intersect. If you continue them through, they intersect the axis of the secondary hull, right? They're sort of centered, whereas the struts on the movie Enterprise are really kind of up high, right? And it makes sense when you see they've created this long intermixed chamber, and it's at the top of the secondary hull, and so that's what. Okay, I kind of got why they did that, but it's like, yeah, okay, I just don't like it as well.
I mean, listen, it's kind of like, which is your favorite Star Trek series? It's like you almost always have to take TOS out of the mix because it's so fundamentally,
everything about it is different.
Yeah.
In terms of how combat works, in terms of sort of, everything about it is different.
Everything about it, and it's 20 years before the Next Generation. So, it's a fundamentally different. Plus, it's the original series. It's one of the most iconic television shows ever, and so it's kind of hard. So it's kind of that way with the Enterprise. When you look at the Enterprise now, and I'm looking at my Master Replicas Enterprise here, I look at it and I go, it's just totally fundamentally different than the movie Enterprise or the Reliant or any that comes afterwards. It's very, it's much simpler, and it's, from a different era. Listen, I agree with your comments about the NX-01. I mean, I some people didn't like the design, the production design of Enterprise. I love the production design of Enterprise. The challenge I think that people had was they were trying to draw direct lineage from Enterprise then to, 100 years later, you've got Star Trek. How do you get from there to there? And I think you can, but I think that just like we talked about it last night, the challenge we had when we were designing the Ares bridge was, how do you look appropriate? How do you look like Star Trek? How do you look like you're in the general era of TOS, but not have toggle switches?
Yeah, I think this is a problem that you run into that is a bigger problem than an in-universe problem, right? The problem, the comment has been made about science fiction that a given work of science fiction represents 3 time periods: the time period in which it was written, the time period that it's supposedly about, and the time period in which it's consumed. And so the real issue we're running into with this is, it was a show done in the 1960s, and we're trying to compare it to all these things done in the 1980s and beyond, and sort of come up with a consistent design aesthetic.
Yes.
Well, the problem is that there just isn't a consistent design aesthetic. And so I think that the right answer in that regard, going forward, to sort of, Lois McMaster Bujold makes the comment that, or she always says, the author reserves the right to have a better idea. And I think the science fiction equivalent of that, and that's how she justifies the fact that, like, in one novel, she says, this person's father died, and then at some point she decided that she didn't like that, so he doesn't die. When she writes the prequel, he doesn't die, and then going forward, he's around. But he's clearly dead, but no, he's not. Okay, so she had a better idea. And I think the equivalent of that in Star Trek is, it's not the 1960s. What looks modern to us doesn't look modern, or what looks modern to them back then doesn't look modern to us. It looks old, like it's from the 1960s. So evoke the aesthetic so that the audience understands that you're doing that, and move on, right? And while I'm critical of Discovery, I do think that they did a reasonably good job of that when they showed the Enterprise and Discovery. When you go on the bridge, it's like, okay, yeah, I can see where they got that, right? You know, a lot of that is color. But I don't feel bad about fixing things to make it look more modern, or even fixing things that were broke. Like, did you ever see a label on any piece of gear on the original Enterprise? I mean, the Starfleet people must be really good, because none of their gear is labeled. They just know which button is the right button.
Yeah. Andy had a theory about that.
What's Andy's theory?
So I think he had, I think it was something that, gosh, you know what? I'm not sure I can explain it, but they had holographic stuff in the old series, but only the person using the device could see it. Because isn't there some theoretical technology of projecting something directly into your retina?
Okay, so they were seeing a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't see.
That's right. So whereas you have Discovery with all these messy holograms all over the place that everybody can see, in the old series, they'd streamlined it down. Only the individual using the thing needed to see it, and could see it. So
somebody
way more advanced than Discovery.
Somebody made a great comment about that with regard to Star Trek Picard, and that was, you know, you had all these screens up in the air and stuff like that, and that's a really cool effect in 1998. And by now, you know, it's like, okay, I understand you kind of have to do something like that, because if you don't do something like that, you look archaic. But this is a universe that has the holodeck, and it has replicators and all that other technology. So I can't remember who it was that was saying this, but he suggested, like, the captain of the ship could have just had, you know, his controls. When he turned on his controls, what he got was something that was physical, right? It looks physical, because that's the way the holodeck works. And his, you know, he decided he was going to be sort of like eccentric about it. So his looked like a World War II bomber, you know, or something like that. He's got a throttle, and he's got a wheel, and he's got stuff like that. And so when Picard goes down to, and he does the, I don't know how to make this work. Imagine Picard sitting down going like, computer, give me a standard Starfleet panel circa such and such, and there's a little bit of, you know, beaming effect or whatever, and there's the Galaxy class control panel sitting in front of him, at which point he starts doing his thing, because he knows that would be cool. But instead they went with the Air touchscreen that everybody's got.
Wow. The only problem with controls, you don't, just speaking from my own experience, having used touch screens and having used, you know, actual physical controls, the thing about physical controls from a human factors perspective is that I don't have to look at the thing. I can reach for the knob and know that this one is set up in a certain way and has a certain texture to it, you know. Yeah. So this way you can do multiple things at the same time. Whereas if you had just these flat touch screens with no tactile, you could be pressing any button and never know what you're hitting. So
on the SR-71, there were controls that the pilot couldn't see. The pilot or the weapons, the systems operator couldn't see that they were expected to operate. And one of them was the radio. And so it's like back behind them. You have to sort of reach back over here, and with the spacesuit helmet and all the rest of it, it's like, and
right the eject button.
Yeah. And so there was stuff that they literally had to learn how to do it by feel.
Yeah.
Well, I think
that's actually unusual for a U.S. airplane. That's not unusual for a Russian airplane, because Russian ergonomics suck.
Yeah.
Well, so the question you're talking about also is that it's the production design of the ships is representative of the era in which it's being shot. the film is
Yeah.
being shot. So back in the 60s, we were like, hey, this is cool. This is what a starship's going to look like. Meanwhile, you get to the you get to the late 70s in Star Trek: The Motion Picture. It's only 12 years later, and you're like, well, everything's going to be fiber optic, and everything it's going to look like this, and then you get to Next Generation, and it's all. So it all represents the era that you're in, but to your point, Chris, we're basically Picard's got his holographic displays, and some of us are going, oh, yeah, Minority Report was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
What's next? All right, and I'll tell you, and we're at our limit. I'll tell you, but I mean, back in the 70s, 80s, when Craig Thomas's book Firefox came out, and it wasn't the only one. It wasn't the only one. There was another book I was reading, which I'll have to remember the name of, and both those books posited thought control systems in fighter aircraft of the 20th century. So back then, in the 80s, when those books came out, that wasn't that far-fetched, right?
No.
So, but no one's caught on for that on how to fly a starship. No one says, oh, let's just put this thing on I'm going to put my thinking hat on, and I'm just going to tell the starship what to do. I don't have to touch anything.
Hang on. I think that Rick Sternbach, if I'm correct, when he was designing the bridge for the motion picture and stuff, there was some indication there for, and again, I'm getting this information, I believe, from Andy, but there was some indication there that he had written in some stuff for either thought control or some way for the helmsman to.
Yeah, it was like the original script had a thing where Sulu pulled out like this thing and put it on his head and did thought control of the ship. Yeah. Now my brother asked the question in the stream, why not voice recognition? And voice recognition is great, except when you've got multiple people trying to all do it at the same time as they're sitting at their various stations.
There's one other thing I wanted to point out. In Sci-Fi, you have lots of lights blinking and flashing and stuff like that.
Yes.
As a pilot, I can tell you, like, the philosophy behind our plane is that if all the lights are dark, everything's good. When something starts blinking, it's plus, especially in a darkened, cockpit or something at night, any extra light shining in your eye is just irritating. So you don't want lots of blinky, flashy things at you.
And that's
good on screen.
That's one of those things that's changed over time, because it used to be the case that having a status light for a whole bunch of different gear, right, airplanes included, having a status light that was on was important, because when I say light, we're talking about actual light bulbs, right? And so you wanted to guard against the failure mode of your light bulb has burned out. And so you do it by having the all clear sign be on. So if you don't have the all clear sign on, at the very least, you need to know that you need to run a diagnostic to see if your light bulb is burned out. Well, once you start getting to LEDs and stuff like that just don't burn out, and that's no longer a failure mode you have to worry about. And so at that point, design changed from I'm going to give you a positive response that things are good to I'm going to give you a response that things are bad.
Yeah.
And the world got a lot darker.
Yeah. Yeah. And flying around at night, that's better.
Yes. That's definitely better. Now, there was a question that was a while back that asked about if I can do a little brief honorverse thing. I think it was Stephen Voigt. I think that's Mr. Voigt's first name, if I remember correctly.
Scott
Voigt. I'm sorry. I knew that Stephen didn't quite sound right. I think he was the one that asked has David ever thought of doing a book with the designs of the ships in the Honorverse? So that's not a kind of a David sort of thing. That is actually very much a Bu9 sort of thing. and it's not out. It's not really sort of going too far to say that Bu 9 exists because Tom Pope wanted blueprints of a Star Knight. That was really the thing that sort of started us down the path. Was Tom Pope? I think it was Tom Pope. Maybe it was Thomas Maroney. Somebody wanted the blueprints of a Star Knight and started
somewhere.
Yeah, and started. I think it was Tom Pope started talking to Ken Burnside about blueprints of a Star Knight and started working on them. And then there was the original plan to make a movie in the Honorverse. And by the time all the dust cleared, we found ourselves as a group that had a name and everything else. Closest thing that there is to anything that has ship stuff in it is House of Steel.
Yeah.
And if you go towards the back of House of Steel, let me find it. You do have some ship design stuff and some ship histories and things like that. So it's not like blueprints. It's not a hardcore design, but it does have, you know, like a page of ships, half page to a page per ship type with a bunch of illustrations on it. So
yeah, it gives you the mass, the dimensions, the acceleration capability of the vessel, its forward weaponry, aft weaponry. So it gives you some it gives you the weaponry, broadside, chase, and forward weaponry. How many were built and the service life, you know, when it was. So it does that for a bunch of the ships.
Yeah, Tom basically has. I don't think his database, his spreadsheet isn't totally accurate yet, but his goal is basically to have a spreadsheet that has every ship in the Honorverse.
Yeah, and this stuff covers Grayson and Manticore, I assume, right?
Yeah, that's what we did for the first one.
So it doesn't have all the different space nations. So,
yeah. Well, that is, we're over our limit. That is it for that. We didn't even get the shields and inertial dampeners. We will start off our show next week. Talking about that.
It's good we didn't get there because I think that's going to be a big topic, and that's going to lead to my guess is an extended tactics discussion. Because I know Pat. So yeah, it would have been a bridge too far to try to do all of that tonight.
I agree. Well, thank you guys. As always, the hour always goes so fast because I think it's just a fascinating discussion. I hope all our fans out there think so as well. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We had a great Axanar Confidential last night and a lot of new people. Hopefully I saw some of them over here tonight. So welcome. As we mentioned previously, please feel free to join our Patreon campaign for the studio. That's how we bring you, Aries Studios brings you all these wonderful shows. And check out the Aries Studio store, that little scroll at the bottom. All sorts of very cool Axanar swag. We got the blueprints going in the store, although they won't ship until the middle of August, about 2 weeks. The Master System display posters are in there. We've got a lot more coming, so all good. But Pat, thanks for being here.
Yep, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Chris, as always, thank you so much. We will be back tomorrow night for Axanar After Dark at 10 and the promised double secret mystery boxes that I promised everyone. If you're like, what are those? Tune in tomorrow night at 10 and we'll talk about them. That was something fun that we were doing early on in the COVID. I still don't have my test, by the way, 2.5 weeks later, and I still don't have my test results.
Oh, man.
I know, it's crazy. I mean, I'm fine. By this time, it's like, yeah, I think I was sick 2.5 weeks ago. But anyway, we will see you all tomorrow night. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, everyone out there in TV land or in internet land. Please be careful out there and stay safe and wear your damn mask. Take care, all.